Okay.
Welcome everyone to the first in our series on women's health. This is something that Startup Tri-Valley and Avestria Ventures are doing together. And we're kicking this off with really an introduction to the unseen opportunity in women's health. And today, and so before I go on, I would like to thank all the members of our community. The goal of this is to really not only highlight our thought leaders in women's health in the Tri-Valley, but also to really connect our community around this. And so I'd like to give thanks to all our promotion partners. These are partners who went out and used their mailing list to help promote the event. So California Life Sciences, Biocom California, Innovation Tri-Valley Leadership Group, Kilpatrick Townsend, Daybreak Labs, MedTech Color, and then also Fourth Wave. Showing here. And I'd like to walk everyone through our agenda. First, Linda from Avestria Ventures and I are going to kind of kick off and set the stage for how this series came about, but also why Avestria Ventures has focused on women's health as a investment opportunity. And then we're going to segue into a fireside chat with Dr. Tracy Dooley from Avestria Ventures and Dr. Neil Ray, who is the founder of Raydiant Oximetry. And we have set aside some time for audience Q&A, assuming it'll spill over. But I just wanted to welcome people to put your questions in the chat throughout the event. And Ava's going to be monitoring that, and we'll bring things to our attention. And during the event, while the fireside chat is happening, while we're speaking as well. And then, and just let you know, then if your question doesn't get answered, we are additionally having this extra time for audience Q&A. The other thing I'd like to really encourage everyone to do, because we are, as part of our goal, trying to connect this community, it is a virtual meeting. So if you could go ahead, if you want to connect with people who are attending today, just, throw up your name and what you do in the chat, and maybe your LinkedIn link, LinkedIn profile link, if you're open to connecting to the people who are here today. And thank you all for being here. So I'm going to let Linda begin, and then we'll go a little bit more into how this came to be. Linda, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Linda Grube. I'm one of the founders of the Avestria Ventures, and we started Avestria Ventures in 2019, and it came about because in 2010, some business school classmates and I were starting to invest our own capital. And one of the things that we wound up doing is we invested in 8 female founders. And one of the founders was an amazing woman named Surbi Sarna, and she had a device to navigate fallopian tubes for early detection of ovarian cancer. And one of the experiences we had with her was she'd done incredibly well, and she was, her early investors were females largely, and board members were females. And we really saw the potential for the device she was creating. When she went out to raise her Series B, she met with, all the brand name venture capitalists, 95% of whom were men at the time. And she was consistently told that they did not invest in women's health because women's health was a niche business. And, part of that is definitional, but you wonder how the health of 50% of the population can be considered a niche business. But through that experience, we really realized that there had to be a huge opportunity that most venture capitalists were missing. And so that's why we went out and started Avestria Ventures. We invest in early stage women's health companies. female founders of life science investors. And then Yolanda, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much, Linda. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and my organization. So for the next slide, Ava. Basically, I met both Linda, all of our guests today, Linda and Tracy and Neil, through my role as executive director of iGate Innovation Hub. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to building a vibrant economy through supporting a startup community in the Tri-Valley. It's existed since 2010, and we're funded by Sandia National Labs, Lawrence Livermore National Labs, and the cities of Dublin, Livermore, Pleasanton, and the town of Danville. And the way we do this is we have two separate initiatives. One is a physical space, Daybreak Labs, which offers lab space, month-to-month lab space, essentially to early stage companies who are producing a hard tech product, whether it's biotech, needs chemistry, engineering, but basically they need a lab space in order to de-risk their technology and to be able to attract funding. And then through Startup Tri-Valley, we are actually trying to create awareness, recognition, and connectivity through events, communication, and content. And it's the content that is what got me connected to this team here from Raydiant Oximetry and Avestria Ventures. We have a podcast, the Startup Tri-Valley podcast. We were really privileged to have Neil Ray as a guest. Dr. Neil Ray is the founder of Raydiant Oximetry and going to be in our fireside chat later in the program. And while, when the mics were off and we had gone through what Raydiant Oximetry is doing, what they're planning to do, how they're impacting maternal health, mic's off, and he shared with me and my co-host, Lynn Naylor from Innovation Tri-Valley, what a difficult time he was having raising money compared to his peers working in the med tech space who were not addressing women's health issues, and discuss the prescience of his investors, especially Avestria Ventures, and recommended that we have Linda and Tracy on the pod, which we did. And again, another mics off conversation while my co-host and I were sitting there really in, shock and awe at how completely women's health is ignored from every area, whether it's how the data is sliced and diced if it's actually collected, to when women were even allowed to participate in clinical trials. And it was in this off-mic conversation that the idea of a women's health event series to highlight thought leaders like Avestria and Raydiant Oximetry and others in the Tri-Valley, as well as a way to connect the community around this and make it much stronger. That's how this event came to be. So I think some of the shock and awe is about to come. Linda, do you want to continue?
Sure. So I've spent my whole career either working in healthcare or investing in healthcare. And I'm a female. And there was when we started thinking about, does it make sense to start a fund in this area? I started doing more research to make sure I really understood what the opportunity was. And even though I'd been working for decades in healthcare.
Good.
If anyone could turn off their mic if you're not participating, that would be great. But I had not realized that beginning in 1977.
Yeah, I have to go a little bit later.
Raj,
How are you?
Can you turn off your mic, please? I had not realized that beginning in 1977, women had been excluded from participating in clinical trials. So when you think about it, all the drugs and devices that went through the FDA from 1977 to 1993 were only tested on men. So not surprisingly, we saw a lot of drugs being pulled from the market that had bad safety results and in women because they'd never been tested on women. So again, I had not realized that it wasn't until 1993 that women were even allowed to participate in clinical trials. Now, today, women can be in clinical trials, and the FDA is actually encouraging companies to include them in clinical trials. But even today, only 28% of the studies actually bother to analyze the results based on biological sex. So if you had a trial and maybe 40% of the participants were having some particular side effect, it would make a difference if you knew whether those 40% were all females or were all men. And again, that's not happening today. And if you talk to the medical schools about why they're not really including curriculum that it talks about the difference between the two biological sexes in terms of health and disease, they'll say it's because they don't have the data yet. And again, that's because the data is not coming out of the clinical trials. And, it wasn't even until 2016, which was not long ago, that the NIH said, if we're going to fund your research, then you have to include female cells and tissues, and sex-based data must be collected. So it's really hard for me to believe that this is 2023 and this is where we are, but it is the case. Next slide. So then when you think about this, first of all, basically, scientists thought that if you understood a man's health, you would understand a woman's health. And the same was true for medicine. And as Tracy often says, women are not just small men with a uterus. So when you look at it, funding obviously has been similar in terms of women's health not getting proportional funding. So today, only 11% of all NIH funding and 4% of all R&D funding goes to women's health. If you look at some of the sub areas, it's the problem with that becomes really clear. So 66% of all Americans who have Alzheimer's are women, and yet only 12% of NIH funding for Alzheimer's is focused on women. Women are estimated to account for 58% of all rheumatoid arthritis cases, and yet only 11% of NIH funding goes to women. Women are 50% more likely to die in the year following a heart attack than men, and yet only 5% of NIH funding for cardiovascular disease and heart health is focused on women. So in order for us to really change these things, we're going to have to start getting more funding towards women's health. Next slide, please. And again, if you think about women as founders, but also diverse founders in general, that's another area that's been overlooked as an investment opportunity. Less than 2% of venture capital dollars goes to female founders. Less than 1% of all US VC investment in the life sciences goes to women health companies. And yet there's data out showing that diverse funding teams actually perform better. They have 30% higher multiple on invested capital upon exit. They receive 63% higher valuation and 65% higher valuation if they have one or more ethnically diverse C-suite members versus all white C-suites. Not surprisingly, venture capitalists tend to back like entrepreneurs. So if there's a female partner at a venture capital firm, that firm is 2 times more likely to fund females founders and 3 times more likely to fund companies with female CEOs. And yet today, only 14% of all VCs are female, only 3% are Black, and only 2% are Latino. So, we have got to start changing the way that looks and getting the dollars to these entrepreneurs if we really want the highest return on our capital. Next slide. And many people will say they don't invest in women's health because you can't make any money. We're seeing that whereas in 2018, we saw one exit in Envision Women's Health. That was the company I spoke about earlier. We're slowly seeing an increase in the number of acquisitions. So early stage investors are in fact getting strong returns on their investments. Next slide, please. And so that is the background I wanted to give you all on why we truly believe there's an amazing opportunity in women's health. Again, both science and medicine have really not been looking at this as an area for innovation. And so there are huge gaps that these entrepreneurs can fill. Right now, we'd like to turn it over to my partner, Tracy Dooley, and then Neil Ray at Raydiant Oximetry. Raydiant is based in San Ramon, and it's probably the shining star in our portfolio. So we are incredibly excited about what they're doing. Tracy and Neil?
Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. And I'm really excited to be on this fireside chat with Neil, of course. And we've actually done versions of this a number of times. And I think that it really is encouraging to see that folks are starting to learn more and be more interested in women's health. And I think that we're very fortunate that we've got a platform with Yolanda and Linda to extend this ecosystem into the Tri-Valley as much as we can. So again, we're trying to make this a little bit more casual, and so please feel free to put questions in the chat. I will say that the chat goes out, it goes pretty quickly. So if we miss something, please just sort of emphasize that, and Ava will be taking a look at some of the questions in there, and we'll try and keep tabs on that. But I would love to, just make sure that we make this useful for folks and we can have a great conversation. So Neil, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit, and then I will go ahead and tell them about my background, and we'd love to hear more about Raydiant, obviously.
Sure. Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Yolanda, for inviting me to this opportunity to share our story. My name is Neil Ray. My background, I'm a pediatric anesthesiologist. So I've been in clinical practice since 2006. And in 2016, about 10 years after clinical practice, came up with this idea to develop a new way to monitor babies during childbirth, with the goal of more accurately detecting fetal distress, which could lead to better utilization of C-sections and earlier recognition of babies in trouble during childbirth. So we've been working on this since 2016, and I'm delighted to be here and share the opportunity with you guys.
Thanks, Neil. And, the first time I met Neil in 2019, I was just incredibly impressed with what he was doing before starting to work with Linda at Avestria Ventures. Back in the day, I was in medicine, and so I went through medical school and earned my MD, and then moved over into the commercial side. So even after spending, close to 20 years in the commercial side, there are things that never really I'd seen in my training were around, pregnancy and childbirth and the various outcomes that happen, and unfortunately a number of outcomes that could be either potentially prevented, right? Or more frustratingly, outcomes that we didn't have the tools to prevent, and I think that, meeting Neil in 2019 and hearing his story just really resonated with me, not just, as somebody who, enjoys and likes to live and breathe healthcare, but also, as a woman and a mother with a daughter. I would love for you to maybe share a little bit about how you came to Raydiant Oximetry, what sort of was the impetus behind you starting the company, and sort of what was that moment that really made you say, I've got to do this?
Sure. So as an anesthesiologist, I have access to 10 to 15 vital signs when I take care of a patient to keep that patient safe during surgery. My obstetrical colleagues, when they deliver a baby, they have access to one vital sign, and that vital sign is called fetal heart rate monitoring. And this is a technology that's been around since 1960. There's been zero innovation in the space. It's difficult to interpret. If you ask 5 different clinicians to interpret fetal heart rate monitoring, you'll get 3 to 4 different answers. And literally on a good day, this technology is worse than a coin toss in predicting fetal distress. There are very few things that are worse than a coin toss. This is actually one of them. Worse than a coin toss in predicting fetal distress. And so what happens as a consequence is we do a lot of unnecessary C-sections on mothers during childbirth because we think the baby's in trouble, but they're not. The monitor is wrong. And now we subject mom to this major abdominal surgery, which has lifelong consequences. And on the flip side, because this technology is wrong more often than right, it fails to miss out on babies that are truly in distress. Those babies go on to develop irreversible brain damage, and it destroys families. It's catastrophic. It's horrible. And me as a pediatric anesthesiologist with access to all these monitoring modalities, I said, hey, we're able to monitor brain oxygen through a skull. Why can't we monitor a baby's oxygen through a maternal abdomen? And I had that aha moment in 2015 and thought, you know what? I think that there's an opportunity here to develop a better way to monitor babies. The problem was I have a clinical background. I'm not an engineer. I don't have a business background. And I didn't know how to get started. I was just a clinician with an idea. And I had to figure out how to go from my idea to implementing something, to make impact in a meaningful way.
Thanks, Neil. I mean, it's really incredible to see, how far you've come since starting it in 2015. What were some of the things that were really helpful to you starting out, and how, what are some of the formative things that shaped how you're building Raydiant Oximetry?
It's the power of the network. I didn't have a network, and I didn't know people who knew how to get things done in medical device development. And so I had to go out there and meet a whole new group of people, because I only knew clinicians. I've worked in hospitals, since I finished training, and I didn't know engineers. I didn't know folks in medical device development. And I just kind of had to throw myself out there and build my network. And what I learned was the medical device ecosystem is wonderful because people are so interested in innovating and helping patients, and they're generous with their time. And it was through building my network that I was able to figure out, how do you form a company, and how do you write a provisional patent, and how do you write a grant, and how do you build a prototype, and how do you do some testing on the bench and then on animals, and it was all these things that I had never thought about that I had to one by one systematically figure out, and it was through the power of the network.
Yeah, that's really impactful. And, that's something we value very much too. And the power of an ecosystem and a network like this is really incredible.
Yeah, and I would say that the network in the Tri-Valley specifically is incredible, because so we're building a technology that's based on pulse oximetry. And pulse oximetry is essentially color analysis of light. And one of the first companies to develop pulse oximeters was a company called Nellcor out of Pleasanton, California, out in Tri-Valley. And so the Tri-Valley was super rich in terms of the ecosystem that was offered for me to build my network and figure out how to, go from an idea to a real product.
Yeah. When you were talking to people about your idea, tell me a little bit about what the response was to you building in women's health and prenatal health compared to something like cardiology. What was the understanding?
No, it wasn't easy. A lot of people thought that the idea wouldn't work, it wouldn't be impactful. And I'm thinking to myself, how many babies have you delivered? What medical school have you gone to? When did you get your board certification? There are a lot of people that had a lot of strong opinions about what I was thinking about doing wasn't going to get anywhere. And so I just had to be strong in my conviction and align myself with people who understood the mission, the vision, and believed that this was an impactful opportunity and worth pursuing. But in the beginning, it's really hard because you not only are people doubting you, but you're doubting yourself. You've got imposter syndrome. Are you capable of executing on this? And it's hard to hear negative feedback, but I knew that there's a real unmet clinical need here. I had experienced it in my clinical practice, and there is no denying that. And so had to be something done about this unmet clinical need.
Yeah. And Neil, I think when I've heard you, when I've had the fortune to both hear you talk and to obviously, interface with you, I think, some of these really powerful statistics are almost so obvious that people forget about them if they're not educated. But for example, right, everybody's got to be born, right? So let's just start there. So when we hear VCs talking about, sort of the market in women's health, right, obviously women make up more than 50% of the population. But, when we think about 350 million births in the US every year, right? And this being a technology that could potentially be used in every single birth, right? I mean, everybody who
It's
goes
a
in the
big
hospital
market.
gets a pulse ox, right?
It's a big market.
So that's
yeah.
an enormous market, right? And I think that, it doesn't take a whole lot of digging to just think about those numbers. But for some reason, people are not used to really thinking about women's health in that way. But the numbers are staggering and massive. And you're going after an enormous untapped market here that is clearly being very underserved in terms of availability of data that can help clinicians to make better decisions. So I think
And I would like to add, I think the development of this technology is very timely with what's going on in our country at the moment. So we have, for those who don't know, the worst maternal mortality of any developed country around the world. The United States has the worst maternal mortality. More moms die here in our country than in many other developed countries. And those statistics are mind-blowing. And if you're a woman of color or you come from poverty, you're 3 to 4 times more likely to have a major significant morbidity or mortality event. And why is that in our country in 2023 that it's like this? So that's a whole different conversation, but I think the fact that we're working on something that directly addresses that sobering statistics is very timely.
absolutely, it's something that we, it's embedded and it can't be ignored. And so I think that's really impactful that you're doing this. And, for the audience here too, and maybe for some folks who are thinking about going into entrepreneurship themselves, right? We've known Neil since 2019 when we first invested in Raydiant, and sort of with my VC hat on, I think what was so compelling about Raydiant Oximetry was a number of things, right? It's one, enormous unmet need, right? Enormous market opportunity, really the opportunity to change outcomes, right? And I think that's really important for us. And I love to see that there are so many folks who are sort of working in the space that I've seen various people put this in the chat, the backgrounds. But, if clinicians don't have great info, if people don't have the right opportunity to make better decisions, then, and you don't have that data, you can't generate better insights, you can't get to better outcomes. And so when Neil was telling us what he was building at Raydiant, right? I mean, this really hit all those various points. And we pushed really hard about clinical adoption, understanding, reimbursement, the business model, everything. And, Neil, being a clinician and a first-time CEO, I mean, it's just incredible, seeing, Neil, how far you've come. You were already pretty sophisticated when we chatted with you, right? And now having shepherded the company from seed through, starting to raise a Series B, I think, and being on the cusp of pivotal trials is just really, really impressive. So I
don't know if you know this, Tracy, but I actually never wanted to be in a startup. I had a pretty good, cushy life. I was an anesthesiologist on my way to becoming a full professor, working in an academic medical center. And I thought, hey, I've got this great idea. I'm going to tell my great idea to a bunch of people and they're going to run with it. And I could be sort of on the sidelines, cheering them on and being an advisor, maybe on the board. And what I realized was no one was going to just run with the idea. No one believed in the idea. If it was going to go anywhere, it had to be me. And so I had to make a tough decision. Do I want to give up sort of what was a cushy, comfy life and almost start all over? and throw myself out there. And I did, because I thought that this opportunity was important enough for me to do it. Because if I wasn't going to do it, then who was? But yeah, I never really wanted to be initially a startup CEO or founder. And now today, I don't think I would do anything else. It's interesting.
Well, we're so glad you're doing that, because otherwise we would never have the opportunity to support that. And you've talked a lot about your personal journey here, but I think, it's sort of, you can't extricate that from the story of Raydiant as well. As you've been moving along this path, what are there things that surprised you? Are there things that you would want to share with folks in the room who are at an earlier stage in their entrepreneurship journey compared to you?
Yeah, being an entrepreneur is not for everyone. It's not for the faint of heart. But I think my experience in medicine actually prepared me well to be an entrepreneur. And a lot of things, what I have to do on a day-to-day basis is, for example, I have to sell. I have to sell myself. I have to sell my vision. And I never thought of myself as someone who sold. But the reality is that I've always sold myself, right? Getting into med school, getting into residency. When I meet a patient and I need to give that patient anesthesia, I need to sell myself as someone competent who's going to take care of them and keep them safe during that procedure. So I had to shift the way I thought about things. But the reality was I had actually been doing what I needed to be doing every day. So I had to learn how to sell. I also had to get comfortable making decisions with incomplete information. And, in healthcare, we're always doing that. We'd love to have hundreds of tests before we make the final diagnosis and treatment plan, but you just don't. You can't. It's not cost effective. And that's the same way with startups. You've got to make important decisions with limited information. And a person on my board told me early, Debbie Riesenthal, who came from Nelcor, she said, making the wrong decision is better than making no decision. And I mean, I still remember that every day. You've got to make decisions, right? And making wrong decisions are actually better than making no decisions. Yeah. So I feel like a lot of what I do on a day-to-day basis, I actually learned in medicine. And who would have thought, right? Who would have thought that like a clinical career would train you and prepare you to be a startup founder, CEO?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's so powerful, right? Just being able to continue to make decisions in the face of that uncertainty, and that agility and that ability to assess risk and get comfortable with increased levels of risk is something that's, not everybody can balance that effectively.
Right.
So,
you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable almost on a daily basis.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something I think really appreciate, and as you say that, right, there's a lot of similarities in venture too, right? Because we're essentially assessing risk and evaluating ways to mitigate it, right, across the portfolio, across our investments and things like that. So at a little bit more of a macro level than the day-to-day business operations decisions. But absolutely, so much of it just comes down to taking a framework and being able to apply it in a number of different ways and moving towards a solution. Yeah. So it's really incredible to see what you're doing. How do you feel as far as, where did you imagine you would end up when you started this journey in 2015? And have you been surprised by anything since then, or,
Oh, there's so many things, right? Like you could write a book based on the journey, but I would say I love the women's healthcare ecosystem. Not only has the ecosystem embraced me, even though I'm not a woman, but it just, I think the values in our ecosystem kind of have transformed. I like the version of myself that I've become, if that makes sense. I think we're very collaborative. We help each other. There are a bunch of people on the call that are, friends of mine, and just we support each other. And I just love our community and how we support each other. And it's not a zero-sum game. It's not competitive, right? We're all here to make lives better for mothers and babies, and whatever we can do to help each other, we do. So I love being in this ecosystem, and I never would have thought I'd be saying that 5 years ago.
Yeah, completely echo that. And maybe I'll turn it around a little bit too. What have been some of the most impactful or helpful things that you've gotten from an investor, right? What do you look for when you're evaluating investors who are interested in investing in your company, and in what ways has that sort of helped you, or have you had lessons learned?
Taking an investor on is like a marriage. Sometimes I spend more time with you and Linda than I do my wife, right? But it's a 10-year marriage at minimum. And when you're fundraising, you're so desperate for money, right? You've got to figure out how you're gonna make payroll, how you're gonna hire, how you're gonna build your MVP, all these things that you need the money for, and you don't think about who you're taking money from. But it's really important that there's good alignment, not when just things are good, but when things aren't going well. And you don't have that visibility necessarily when you meet someone for the first time. It's like an arranged marriage, right? Like you've got to make a decision based on limited amount of information. And sometimes your gut feeling is the best instinct that you have. It's the best data point you have. And you just got to make sure that, is this someone, when things aren't going well, that I can I'll be able to work with, and who will have my back.
Yeah.
And same with your management team, right? So we've built a new team, a team. We've got now 10 full-time employees, and I think I've got the best management team. We've got each other's backs.
Yeah, the culture you've built is really something incredibly special, right? And so I think, to echo your sentiments about the ecosystem and the network, right? I mean, we also feel really fortunate to be participating in this, and to really help encourage other folks to come in and be part of this community, and to grow the community in whatever ways we can, right?
Yeah, because there are so many unmet clinical needs in women's health. And they're not necessarily hard problems to solve. Someone just needs to focus on it. And I think if a lot of these problems, with enough time and resources, we can fix. It's just someone has to go there and have the backing to be able to say, I'm going to fix this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say to folks too, on the call, that I think it's been really encouraging seeing the arc of the women's health space evolve over the last few years, frankly, right? I think in 2019, there wasn't a whole lot of understanding around, why is women's health an opportunity? And we've been sort of doing a lot of education along with other folks in the space around why this is such an important opportunity. But, clearly, the FDA and the NIH have been recognizing this, and things have been moving a little bit more slowly. We now have guidance, just a few weeks ago coming out around diversity in clinical trials, but also in 2021, Merck spun out its women's health assets into a publicly traded company called Organon, which is, now a publicly traded women's health company. So seeing these big, sort of battleships move incrementally, like the FDA, the NIH, but then also seeing public companies move in that direction too, I think is really gives me a lot of confidence in the future for the space, right? We don't expect everything to change on a dime, but I think that there's great recognition at levels of various organizations that are really trying to address this, and to try and put more resources and attention towards a lot of these unmet needs in women's health. So we just feel really fortunate to be where we are with this, and to be partnered with you, Neil, on this journey.
It takes a community, right? And I'm getting all the credit, but the reality is that there's a great team behind me of my management, my board, my investors, right? That have all made this possible. So I get the credit, but the reality is I don't deserve much of it.
entrepreneurs have the heaviest lift. So I would say you deserve a lot. So we really appreciate that folks have been joining us, and you know, I could talk to Neil all day, and sometimes we do, and unfortunately, you know, taking time away from his wife and kids. But I would love to open it up and just see if there are other folks who have various questions or anything like that that we can answer. And if you can put things in the chat, that might, or raise your hand using the reaction buttons, that might be the cleanest way for us to do this. So the first person I see here is Lydia Meyer-Turkson. Go ahead.
Hi, hello Tracy. Really great event. Really have appreciated the insights, Neil and others. And we hear these statistics all the time about, I don't know, 1% of R&D outside of oncology spent on women's health. All of these stats. If you had a magic wand to change something really impactfully, what would it be? And it's a multiple question, so I'm curious what other people's thoughts are.
There are a lot of things. And I love the magic wand question. We used to use that all the time at the VA. I think the one thing that I would change broadly is to have people understand that women's health, we're talking about healthcare. So we really should just be talking about healthcare and have people understand that, you know, we shouldn't, ideally, we shouldn't be having to address this gap at all, right? But I think for people to understand that healthcare is an enormous and growing market, the women's health aspect of it, we're having to name that specifically just because of the unmet need there. But I think it would much be benefited from an acknowledgement that we need to be really just stratifying data at the very basic level, right? Everybody should be doing this, right? But I think if they the sooner that acknowledgement happens at various levels, then the sooner we can get to, you know, better data, better insights, better outcomes for folks. So that's
we need a pipeline, right? So if you think about what's the natural course of medtech innovation, you've got an academic researcher with NIH grants, and they have PhD students, and they develop a technology for their PhD. When they graduate, that technology goes to tech transfer, is available for a startup company to commercialize. So now that startup company acquires that technology, there's early stage funding to develop that technology, then there's growth stage venture funding to commercialize it, and then there are strategic acquirers to take that technology and put it into their portfolio. And then the whole cycle starts over again. We have so many gaps in women's health because we don't even have the pipeline from the beginning. There's no NIH dollars to support NIH funding for PhD students to develop technologies, right? Tech transfer offices at universities don't have technologies. There's very little early stage venture, very little growth stage. So the whole pipeline is broken, and we've got to develop that pipeline. So it just becomes one big ecosystem, one cycle.
It looks like, actually, Ava, do you have your?
Yes, I do. So I'm actually part of Avestria, and I've been trying to help monitor the chat as well. But I do have a question for Neil and then maybe for Tracy. Do you think that being in the Tri-Valley rather than Silicon Valley has had you at a disadvantage? Or have you found that the location almost doesn't matter as much as the opportunity that you're trying to pursue?
I think in terms of the culture we built at Raydiant Oximetry, it's far superior being in the Tri-Valley than it would be in the Peninsula. I think people love living in the Tri-Valley and working in the Tri-Valley, whereas when you're in the Peninsula, it's a little bit of job hopping. It's hard to get people really dedicated to your mission, and they'll leave if they can find a job where they can make more money, you know, down the street. So in terms of culture building, hands down, Tri-Valley is the place to be. I have zero doubt about that, and very strong convictions on that.
And I would also say that, you know, from our perspective, it's a bit of a differentiating point as well, right? You know, the Valley is big and sprawling and encompasses a lot, and there's a very rich ecosystem in the Bay Area at large, right? But I think that also, particularly during hot markets, a lot of that, it's hard to separate the signal from the noise. And so when you've got geographic distinction, when you're able to sort of pull away from that a little bit and be able to say, okay, this is what I'm building, and we really can talk about the fundamentals, and you're a little bit more removed from a lot of the hype. I think that's a positive thing for investors like us who are focused on fundamentals as well. And so we really value that. And I think it says a lot being able to be forward thinking and to build in an area that has such rich diagnostics and med tech and life science capabilities with all these big companies, and manufacturing capabilities and things like that as well. So it sort of really speaks to the maturity of founders who are able to look down the road and think about not just their next raise and where is the capital, but how do they build for the long term. I think that's incredibly valuable. So, Tri-Valley entrepreneurs out there, we love to see those. So yeah.
Yeah, and for anyone thinking about where they want to set up shop for their company, definitely look into the Tri-Valley. It's worth having a look.
So in terms of other questions, if people have a couple of questions, we're happy to take those, but we could also start wrapping up as well. Neil, any final comments?
No, I mean, what would make me really happy is if I know you guys at Avestria are fundraising at the moment, that if someone said, oh, I saw this webinar and I'm now gonna invest in Avestria so they can make more early stage investments into, emerging women's healthcare companies solving, significant unmet clinical needs. To me, that would be a very successful and very, great outcome from
Thank you. And we're not paying Neil to say this. So, but yeah, absolutely. Right. There's the more folks who, institutions and people and LPs who invest in funds, the more capital we're able to deploy into early stage companies and sort of de-risk the portfolio. And then that also enables portfolio companies to be able to have more capital to de-risk their pipelines. So
there's a question in the chat from Kathleen. Any advice for young people looking to break into the space? So I guess I could start. And really be intentional about how you want to spend your working years, because you spend a lot of time working. And so work on something that's something you're proud of, that's going to keep you motivated, that you'll be happy to tell your kids and grandkids about, because life is short. And if you're not doing something you love, it becomes a drag. So I would say, yeah, make sure that you're doing something that you love.
And then I would follow that up and say that I think that you might have a better chance of finding something that you love when you're working with people who are experienced and who can help you understand how to navigate spaces as you're starting out in your career. So thinking about mentorship and sponsorship and the concept of sort of building your own personal board of directors, I found that, I was definitely not thinking about that when I was starting my career, but there were definitely people that I gravitated towards, as mentors who, would provide insights or who would share their insights with me. And that was really impactful in how I thought about what I wanted to do. And so I will just say, even for me personally, the things that have always really mattered to me and that were sort of the big factors that led to my decision to decide to move out of clinical medicine and not pursue a path on the clinical side and instead move to commercial, is that I wanted to work with really smart people, which could be essentially industry agnostic, right? And I wanted to be able to learn continuously, which I'm still doing, right? And then I wanted to be able to make an impact. And for me, that was also, most likely going to be in healthcare, right? But, when there are sort of broad things that can impact folks and that can that can inform how you think about various things. Those just happen to be mine. But the more you talk with other people, the more you might say, oh, this resonates with me, or this is something that might not be as helpful for me. And that's impactful. And the other thing on the investing and the entrepreneurship side of things is that at Avestria, we very much value expertise, right? Because healthcare is an incredibly complex place to navigate. And Neil's decades of experience as an anesthesiologist, right, and pediatric anesthesiologist are definitely not to be discounted. I think you've all probably seen these, stories in the news about people who decided they could come and disrupt healthcare and without understanding the industry. And I think that that's the expertise is absolutely to be valued. So the 30 under 30 lists and the 40 under 40 lists are not necessarily are not necessarily the same thing as being able to, don't necessarily translate into being able to build a really successful, impactful company. So I would just say that being able to work with people who have experience and expertise is incredibly valuable where you can get that. Okay.
Hi, my name is Navneet. I have a quick question for Neil. I'm just interested in knowing why we have more mothers dying in US versus other developed countries. I know we are wrapping up, but that I was just curious.
No, it's a good question. It's complex, but I would say if you look at the number 1 and number 2 reasons why women die during childbirth, it's cardiovascular reasons and then hemorrhage. Those number 1 and number 2. And women, when you've had a prior C-section, usually your first C-section is not so dangerous. It's the second or third C-section that becomes more dangerous. And one of the practices in our country is once you've had a C-section for the birth of your baby, your subsequent childbirths will be C-sections. So there's the hemorrhage aspect and then the cardiovascular aspect. Then there's the fact that women are having children at an older age than they used to 50 years ago. There's more diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity. So it's a complex situation. Some of it we don't even fully understand, but there's definitely things we can do that are low-hanging fruit to start addressing this. It's estimated that around the world, a woman dies during childbirth every 4 minutes. And half of those are from hemorrhage. And about 80% of maternal deaths are deemed preventable. So there's, that just tells you that there are things we can do with enough resources to change these trends.
Thank you for sharing that, Ray. And how far is your company along with developing the oximeter?
Yeah, so we just completed a pilot study, our first clinical proof of concept. So now we're raising a Series B to do a pivotal study, and the pivotal study will be used to get FDA clearance. So we're about 3 years away in a 10-year journey. The average medical device journey is about 10 years.
Got it.
So a lot of vision, a lot of heart, a lot of passion, a lot of hard work, and I do want to highlight too, we've been talking about women's health, right? But clearly we also want to highlight that there's so much intersectionality, a lot of touching on the question about the US, right? Structural racism is a huge problem in the US. And so we know that, racism, not race, right, but is a social determinant of health. And so that obviously impacts a number of, moms who are here versus other countries. And then, one of the things that I think is incredibly valuable about how Neil has been thoughtful at all different levels is that when he started enrolling patients in their pilot, right, in the skin color scales, like with the Fitzpatrick scores, he was able to enroll basically within the first 10 patients, he had at least one patient in each of those categories, right? So just really staying on top of all these different things, right? Women's health is not only about biological sex, but it's a little bit of a shorthand about how do we think about, folks who are underserved and the intersection of all of this, right? And women's health encompasses all these other areas as well. So, I mean, I think we love talking to people who are innovating in this space. I will say that for any entrepreneurs who have put details in the chat, the best way to connect with us is through our website. It's at avestria.vc. And if you want us to evaluate your opportunity, you can do /entrepreneurs, and there's a form there that you can fill out, and then our team will evaluate those. And that's the best way to keep all the information straight, so that we make sure that it doesn't get lost in an email inbox or anything like that, so that we can get back to you. But we love chatting with folks about this, and so we're really excited to see that all of you have joined us for the talk today, and for also, just asking such wonderful questions and being part of this network. So I'll turn it back over to Ava and Yolanda to wrap this up.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Neil, and Linda, and Ava, and everyone who's joined us here today. What's next for us? This is, I think, a first step in really trying to build this community around the thought leaders you've heard from today. There are many other thought leaders here in the Tri-Valley and in the area. We plan to keep having women's health events, some of them remote, some of them in person, and we'd like to see this culminate in an in-person women's health summit in the Tri-Valley for everyone to actually get together in person and make some of those connections. So check for updates at the startuptrivalley.org, Unseen Opportunity Women's Health. It's on your screen. And then, I know a number of people have connected via LinkedIn. Ava put up all our contact details. Please let us know if you want to raise a hand. Maybe you're an expert we should be tapping into, or you know of one, or you have topic ideas that you'd like us to cover. We really encourage everyone here to reach out to us with their thoughts and ideas. And thanks again. Ava, did I get everything?
I think you did. So just once again, thanks everyone for coming. We're really looking forward to continuing the conversation around women's health and supporting people who are interested in the space, people who are innovating in the space, and people who just really want to see women's health be funded and be supported from now on.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. See you.